Exercise Set 2-1, Finding Relevant Examples, from a Workbook for Arguments by Morrow and Weston. The objective of this exercise set is to give you practice finding relevant, appropriate examples to support a generalization. The instructions. We're going to go through the sample exercise and all of the odd number exercises from Exercise Set 2-1. After I present each example, pause the video and find 2 or 3 relevant examples to support each of the following generalizations. You may have to do a little research to find good examples in some cases. After each example, I'll give an explanation. For your graded assignment, you'll complete all of the even-numbered exercises from Exercise Set 2-1. Okay, let's begin. Here's a sample. Lots of professional sports teams are named after animals. Okay, so now pause the video and come up with some examples that will support this generalization. So, a possible example could include the Chicago Bulls, the Florida Marlins, the Philadelphia Eagles. These are all professional sports teams named after animals. And living in the Pacific Northwest, we can add a 4th example, perhaps, of the Seattle Seahawks. Now, look at the connection between these examples and the generalization. So the generalization is lots of professional sports teams are named after animals. Some questions that are going to come up about the quality of this generalization is, what exactly is it that we mean by lots? Do we mean more than half? Do we mean more than a quarter? It's hard to say. And I'm also not sure, and this argument doesn't tell us, what percentage of professional sports teams are named after animals. But this is something we want to keep in mind, is that we want the language in the conclusion of our generalization to be supported in the best way possible by the examples that we use. Okay, let's move on to number 1. All birds can fly. Okay, pause the video and come up with some examples that can support this generalization. Alright, so some possible answers include pigeons, parakeets, and swans. But, again, let's look at the conclusion, or the conclusion that these examples are supposed to generalize to. All birds can fly. Can you think of anything that would work against this generalization? Of course, the answer is any bird that can't fly. The first one that comes to mind for me is a penguin, but then there's also ostriches. So there's 2 examples that would suggest that the generalization, all birds can fly, might be a troubling one. And then this is to say nothing about the example of birds that are somewhere in between birds that can fly and birds that can't. Example 3. Everyone who walked on the moon in the 20th century was an American. Okay, pause the video, and for this one you may need to do some research and come up with some examples that support this generalization. A possible answer might include Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Ken Mattingly. Now, I'm not sure, I didn't look into it, but presumably we know everyone who's walked on the moon. And it may very well be the case that everyone who's walked on the moon in the 20th century was an American, and that this list here of these 3 people exhausts everyone who's walked on the moon. So notice in that case, if that's true, our generalization that everyone who walked on the moon in the 20th century was an American would be very strong. Okay, let's move on to the next example. Most fruits are sweet when they're ripe. Okay, pause the video and come up with some examples that support this generalization. Okay, some possible answers include pineapple, orange, and guava. And again, like in many of the previous examples, it's important to see how the conclusion is worded. So this conclusion is worded, most fruits are sweet when they're ripe. So again, the question here is, what do we mean by most? Now, generally speaking, one thing you can mean by most is more than 50%. And we could figure out how good of a generalization this could possibly be if we figured out how many fruits there were, and then how many fruits were sweet when they were ripe. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Developed democratic countries no longer practice capital punishment. Go ahead and pause the video, and again, this one may require some research to come up with a couple examples that support the conclusion. Some examples of developed democratic countries that no longer practice capital punishment include Australia, Italy, and Canada. Okay, let's move on to the last example. England has produced famous musicians. Okay, pause the video and come up with a few examples that support this generalization. Now, there's probably all kinds of examples that support this generalization, but the three that our book chose are John Lennon, Elton John, and Adele. Now, again, notice how this particular conclusion is worded. England has produced famous musicians. So all we would need to support the conclusion of this generalization is some number of famous musicians who are from England, because the conclusion is simply that England has produced famous musicians, more than one. So as long as we can come up with at least two famous musicians that are from England, we can support this generalization.